Welcome to a special edition of the Closing the Gap from the Research Sofa. I'm Simon Gilbody, Director of the UKRI Closing the Gap Network, and today I'm joined by one of the absolute greats, Professor Til Wykes from King's College London. So good to see you, Til.
And good to see you, Simon.
And we've got a few questions for you today, and it's a special from the Research Sofa because it's a special week. It's the launch of a series of research goals that have been crafted over the last few years and that Til has led. So my first question to you, Til, is for the viewers who don't know about you or your work, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your work, just thinking about how you might have thought about closing the gap for people with severe mental ill health?
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist, but I'm also a researcher, and I've just about done everything. I've done sort of basic science, I've evaluated services, I've developed treatment. And I've done that across lots of different conditions. But actually, the main focus of most of the research has been in psychosis. So, you know, I've developed medication side effects measures for medication for people with psychosis. I've developed treatments like cognitive remediation, and I've evaluated community services and the implementation of treatments into services. So I'm kind of, you know, really, I should be an expert in something, but I'm not sure that I am an expert in anything, but psychosis is what I've been doing my work on. But probably the one constant throughout all of this has been the involvement of service users in the design and management of studies, and now, of course, in co-production. So that's the only thing that's constant across the whole thing.
And in that, you've been an absolute trailblazer, so credit where it's due. Really important development over the past 20 years, and we know you've been at the forefront of that. So we're really excited about these goals, 4 research goals that have come out this week. And I wonder if you could tell us on the network why it's important to have goals in research.
Well, I think we know from the studies that have been carried out by RAND Europe that it takes a lot of time for research to be implemented and provide benefit both to society and to individuals. And to be quite honest, I'm not as patient as I was, and I really would like research to be focused a bit more, less curiosity science. So I think my motivation was really to see some change soon. And the other thing that RAND Europe said about research was that if you focused on the outcome while you were doing the research, it is more likely to have an effect, and it's more likely really to lead to a good societal impact. I think without clear targets and goals, we'll just be amassing a lot of information. We won't know which way we're going. We won't know how fast we're moving in terms of being able to have an impact. And also for many people, we won't have any understanding of the achievements that we've made. So goals allow you to do that. And I should probably tell you where it all started.
Please do.
It started, in fact, in a conversation with Chris Whitty, who everybody knows now. And we were talking about mental health, not about COVID. And it was the next step after research priorities. What would help research? And we got priorities. I was involved in the European version where we looked at something called ROMA, which is the research priorities for that we should be thinking about. But that's not, research priorities are not actually goals. And he suggested, which was a fantastic idea, which was to develop sustainability goals for mental health, and particularly for mental health research. So to have the research aimed at something which was stretched and measurable, but would focus everybody's attention. So it would focus the scientists, it would focus the funders, and it needed to be important to service users. So that's where it kind of all started, really. And we all got together, all of those groups. We got service providers, people in policy, researchers like you, Simon, and of course, importantly, service users. And probably even more importantly, to get buy-in was the funders' perspective as well. And we all got together, starting with the kind of Roma priorities and thinking, you know, how many we needed. You know, we started off, if you remember, we started off with 6, and then we went down to 2, and then we went up to 3, and then we went up to 4, and eventually settled on 4 individual priorities, which in some way, bits of them are related to each other, but they have a clear focus and they're definitely stretched. So I think
that's really useful to hear about where they came from. So we are really excited about the goals in the report that's been produced, and it's the second of those goals that would be of the greatest interest to members of the Closing the Gap network. It's a really ambitious goal. It puts physical health and mental health on the same page, and it highlights some of the profound health inequalities experienced by people who use mental health services. So Til, could you tell us a little bit more about goal number 2 and how it got in there?
Okay, so, well, people watching this will know or will feel like this is an important, otherwise they would never have come to your channel. But we thought physical and the relationship between physical and mental health problems was really important, because we know that half the people with, or nearly half the people with a mental health problem also have a physical problem. But on the other hand, about a third of the people who have a physical problem also have a mental health problem. So that's things like people having asthma or arthritis. We know that there are relationships between them. And this goal is particularly important because it not only produces a burden for the individuals who have the difficulties, both difficulties, but it also affects the economic costs of health. So we also thought it would actually spur on maybe the policymakers, particularly, to implement some of the research that comes out of this particular goal, because we know that having both physical and mental health problems will increase the costs. But of course, for people with severe mental illnesses, there are specific things associated both with taking medication or not taking or not things outside of the medication relationships. And some of those clearly lead to major issues in terms of mortality. And we know that it's, well, all the numbers change depending on the group of people you're looking at, but it's, some of them are around about 17 years for people with severe mental illness. And that is a huge gap that we really ought to be doing something about. I mean, the gap is with the general population. We know the gap is smaller for people who just don't have quite as much money as everybody else. So we know it's related to lower income as well, which covers those people with mental health problems. So we know the gap is smaller there. So what we really need to be thinking about is specific interventions that we can provide for people with physical and mental health problems, and also try and think of policies which will actually improve the health of the nation. So part of the research that we'll be doing in this will help in general, as well as specifically for people with mental health difficulties.
So that's brilliant. We think the gap's important as well. We think it's so important that we put it in the title of our network. So we're the Closing the Gap network. So look what we did there. So here's my final question. So looking to the future, I know that Chris Whitty would encourage you to do this. How will we know if the goals that we've set in place have done their job?
Okay, well, for all the goals, there are potential measures that we've suggested. Now, we can't actually do the measures, but we know where the measures are. I think particularly some of the others are much easier to see, because they're in this one, in goal 2, which you're mainly interested in, it's not just that we have a goal, we also have targets. And the targets are aimed at, for this particular one, on the understanding of the links, because if we start to understand the links and the mechanisms, we can then think about what are the most effective interventions, which is the second target, which is developing effective interventions and implementing them. But for this goal, which ends with eliminating the mortality gap, now that is a really stretched goal. And there was some discussion about whether we should actually have that as a goal, with some people, often scientists, actually saying, well, you can't expect us to do that because we can't. And it's true. It takes a long time for interventions in this area to be seen later. But what we can do is look at the interim measures as we go along. So we could look at physical health indicators like cardiac health. We can look at incidence of diabetes. We can look at the incidence of smoking in this group. And we know that anything which reduces those incidences is likely to have an effect later on in life. But we also know that, for instance, improving physical exercise might improve health and well-being, and that's a good thing for everybody, particularly everybody who's been in lockdown and, you know, the only thing they've done is walk around the neighborhood and not done much more. I think we need to do something more for those people. But although we can measure everything, we have set out this series of things that we should be measuring. It's quite important to remember that if we do the research, we won't necessarily achieve the goal unless the research has actually had an impact. So, you know, we can find out the best interventions, but it's not us as scientists and researchers who will do that. But if we want evidence-based policies, we have to produce the evidence base to know, and these goals allow us to aim for the evidence base, which will then be for the politicians and the policymakers to actually produce something coherent to implement into services and into the NHS mostly, but also into you know, education, schools, universities. It's not just that we're thinking about health as being the ultimate outcome. Brilliant. So I think we do have these things, but also they'll hold our feet to the fire. So we've talked about the mechanisms as being 3, 5, 10, 15 years time, looking forward. Well, we'll know what we've achieved if we measure it. Yep. But we'll also know what the gap is to where we need to move to next.
And that's so important. And so I love the ambition. I love the way you've got a pathway from research into policy, you know, encouraging us to think about implementation. I love the ambition. I saw a piece of graffiti once that said, be reasonable, demand the impossible. So I think that's a good way to end our discussion this afternoon, Til. So it just falls to me to thank you for giving your time and for leading the programme that developed these goals. And we may come back and speak to you in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time to see where we are. So thank you again for your time, Til.
Okay, thanks a lot, Simon.